questions is, what is palliative care, and what is hospice care, what is end-of-life care? It's all in a continuum, and there's a lot of preconceptions about what hospice care is, both good and bad. There's a wide variety of pictures that come to mind. But if we start with the diagnosis of any kind of illness that is considered life-threatening or debilitating, a stroke, a heart attack, early, a lot of people start noticing some changes in their cognitive ability, and that makes, there's the question that's always lingering, am I developing dementia? But at the time of diagnosis, most of us are in a place where we want everything restored. We call that restorative care. We want things put back to normal. If it's broken, we want it fixed. And so disease-modifying treatment or disease-curative treatment is our first choice. And as it turns out that you don't have a disease that's curable, is going to march forward, or sometimes it's not one disease, it's several, and it marches forward, you initially try to restore it, but then less and less about restoring it and more about learning to live with the symptoms. And so the disease-modifying treatment as you go forward becomes less and less, and palliative care or symptom management, palliation of the symptoms, becomes more and more. Hospice care is more at the end, and anymore, there were organizations called hospices that would help reduce the suffering associated with diseases. And then in this country, in the 1980s, I believe, hospice became a Medicare benefit. And the government had to decide, well, we're not going to pay for restorative care and palliative care at the same time, which is a highly debatable concept that causes some problems. But now hospice has become a Medicare benefit with government defined parameters of when hospice care is appropriate. And typically a physician has to certify that he believes that there's a 6-month life expectancy or less. Of course, we can't predict the future, so it's within a reasonable degree of certainty. And depending on the disease, that may or may not be the case. The hospice benefit can be extended beyond 6 months if the physician still believes there's a 6-month life expectancy. So, and then once death occurs, then there's bereavement support for the family and friends. So go ahead to the next slide. The type of decline varies depending on the disease. There are some types of decline that, there's the diagnosis and death may come quickly. Now, all cancer doesn't have this trajectory. Depending on the type of cancer, the stage it's at when it is discovered, the degree of treatment. Sometimes a severe decline is caused by the disease. Sometimes a severe decline is caused by the treatment, with the hopes of a recovery from the treatment and hopefully more benefit from that. But this is sort of just to illustrate the different modes of terminal illness. Often it's a few years, but can happen over a few months. Next slide. Another type of decline is slow decline with intermittent periods of illness, exacerbations of heart attack, one heart attack after another, or congestive heart failure, where you have an exacerbation, the lungs fill up with fluid, you go to the hospital, they get you tuned up, you come back, medicine's adjusted hopefully for a long time. But as the disease marches on, typically the severity of illness gets worse, the closeness to the brink of death before we bring you back gets worse, and the intervals get shorter. And that happens until somebody dies, or often with good decision making, there's usually a point at which a person will say, the benefit of going to the hospital just isn't worth the trouble. I'd rather stay home or stay where I am and do the best you can, keep me comfortable. But if that's not enough, then make sure that I don't suffer too much. And with if people offer that decision, that's a good thing. If the decision is not offered, then somebody gets scared, calls 911, and off we go back to the emergency room. So that's another mode. Next process. And then finally there's a prolonged dwindling or slow decline. And this is more with dementia, Alzheimer's, Pick's disease, multi-infarct dementia. But often it's not quite this, but a conglomeration of many diseases. Subsequent recurrent small strokes, renal failure, some congestive heart failure, or COPD, and it may be several things. But it's slow and it's a gradual process. And in this process, more than the others, one of the most significant things that happens, especially if it's affecting the brain, is you lose the ability to make decisions. And so how the care goes and at what point we make the switch or the transition from trying to restore things to relieving suffering, to stopping the goal of helping people live as long as possible, and just controlling symptoms, is somebody's got to make that decision. And if you haven't made clear indications to your decision makers or chosen decision makers, then often nobody ever makes that decision, and people go for years and years continuing a dwindle, transition from home, several cycles in the hospital to home health, and then finally from the hospital to the skilled nursing facility and intermediate facility, and people can go decades, often 3 to 5 years, without being aware of their circumstances, unless somebody offered a decision-making process. Next slide. So during that process, there are many things that happen. Some of it we can predict and others we can't. There's loss of function. A stroke can cause the inability to perceive. There may be multiple losses of function: hearing, speech, ambulation. It may be subtle, generalized things such as generalized arthritis and weakness and frailty, or it may be something sudden in a stroke where there's paralysis of the arm and leg and loss of speech, or the decreased ability to breathe, decreased ability to ambulate, to walk, to drive. There's pain, pain from cancer, from bone pain, nerve pain, tumor progression, bone metastases, chest pain. And we want relief from that, and often the pain is multifactorial and difficult to control. Sometimes there's gradual bleeding with loss of blood and recurrent transfusions until somebody decides, okay, I don't want another transfusion, just keep me comfortable. But making those decisions, you've got to have a relationship with somebody that can give you the information, that can tell you what life is going to be like if you don't get treatment or transfusions or hospitalization, and what life will be like if you do get the treatment, and what are the consequences of the treatment. And people often have to sit on that decision for a while, or maybe they'll make the decision and then family members come in and they want, don't give up, Dad, rally again. And then sometimes the decisions that the patients make are driven by the family's fear of letting go. And it becomes very complicated, and that's why everybody needs to be involved. And the more conversation that can happen, the more at ease everybody is, that there's a common plan that everybody is prepared for. And that's all about a subject that is difficult to talk about. Bowel obstruction can be very painful with nothing, to do about it other than keep the pain at bay. Sometimes there can be perforation, vomiting, or, people may have this picture of dying peacefully at home, but there's a lot of loss of body fluids and bleeding. In most cases, however, that doesn't happen. Airway obstruction. A lot of people have fear about suffocating, or shortness of breath, fluid accumulation, and liver failure and renal failure. So the point of this slide is that there are many symptoms to control. In medicine, we've gotten very good at controlling almost all symptoms, but the symptoms are more than physical. There's fear, there's loss of relationships, and then there's the complex process of what happens to family relationships during that time. Next slide. So during this time, there's what we're able to do for ourselves. Most of us are independent and we take care of our needs, and sometimes we have some support, but as we lose function, we need physical support or financial support. Much of the medical care that we need is way beyond our means unless we have insurance to cover it. There's family, friends, church. There can be sitters or home health aides, home health nursing services, assisted living, skilled nursing facility, intermediate nursing facility, or hospital. Each of these have costs associated with them, and Barbara will talk a little bit about that shortly. Next slide.
Actually, we'll talk about it now. So if you'll go to the slide with the little dollar sign there, cost of care. As you move through the continuum of where you're going to receive that care, dictated because of your symptoms or functional decline, you're going to see an associated cost to those settings. Independent living might be someone that is very early in a disease process that's just no longer safe to continue to live at home. And while that's more expensive than living in your own home, especially if your home's already paid for, it's still relatively manageable. So $32,000 per year on average for an apartment that you have housekeeping services, you might have maintenance services associated already, and then a congregate dining area and maybe some activities and even some arranged transportation. So if you think about all those services that come together there, that if you would have to pay individually and privately for if you were living at your home in the community, that's not a bad deal. As you move up in the level of assistance that you're needing, assisted living is really the level of care for people that start needing help with activities of daily living, bathing, dressing, maybe even some help transferring from one surface to another, from a bed to a chair, etc. Maybe some help with actually mobilization. So those kind of physical, low medical complexity, maybe high physical assistance or supervision. Cost of care slightly more than independent living. Now, the other thing that we've noticed in our experience is very urban areas like Nashville, Knoxville, Memphis, the cost of those services tend to be slightly higher than in a more rural community. These are Tennessee state averages, though. You'll also see that assisted living costs are probably increasing faster than any other level of service costs because it's a very high demand. Actually, with a growing number of people over the age of 65, largest segment of the population growing, we all know that, but actually not seeing an increase in the number of people living in nursing homes. Why? Because they're getting their home and community-based services and those needs taken care of in an assisted living level of care. So great variety in those costs. So it's very amenity driven, and because there's a lot of high demand for that, you'll see an increase in those rates. Nursing home level of care, that's the big fear factor. Everybody fearful of living in a nursing home and the costs associated with that. True, on average, it's about $83,000 a year, even in our state. And how does that get paid for? I mean, most people don't have that kind of income when you're at an advanced age that you're paying for that, nor do they have the depth of resources that it's very easily paid for. So see what I mean about planning ahead, about where am I going to receive my care, and how am I going to preserve my assets that I can pay for that. You know, if we could do rewind and we all buy long-term care insurance, that'd be one thing. But for a lot of times, for people that need that level of care, it's too late to get long-term care insurance. So you're looking at personal resources, or generally Medicaid is the greatest payer for long-term care in a nursing home. Now you say, what about Medicare? What does Medicare pay for? Yeah, Medicare pays for a very small percentage of care in nursing homes. Skilled nursing facility care, rehab care. It's a maximum of a 100-day benefit period, provided that they are getting skilled care during that period of time. And then that 100 days is renewable. So there may be more than one 100-day benefit period a year, but there has to be a break and spell of illness. Those are Medicare criteria. If you have an HMO, a health maintenance organization, or some sort of managed care organization, their criteria may be a little bit more strict than even Medicare. So Medicare and Medicare replacement insurance policies, not a big payer for long-term care. So I'm just gonna stay at home. I don't have that kind of money, and I'm not leaving my house anyway. I wanna stay at home, and I wanna just let my daughter take care of me. How about that for a plan? Well, there's costs associated with family being your caregiver as well. It may not cost you out of pocket quite as much, but it may cost that family member that's giving up their employment in the community. It may cost them their income, their retirement income. It reduces their Social Security draw at some point in time because they've taken a hiatus from work. But it also has a greater cost than that, a relationship cost. So if you remember that all care has a cost, it's either dollars or it's blood, sweat, and tears, that we need to plan ahead for what kind of care am I anticipating, and where do I want to have that care, and how are we going to get it paid for.